Hello and welcome to another video. In this video we'll be looking at some bizarre BGA to LGA CPUs. These are 5th gen CPUs, so they are from the Broadwell generation, which there wasn't really many desktop CPUs belonging to that made it to hands of PC builders. Like the rare normal 5th gen desktop CPUs, these Sketchy ones from Taobao also require either H97 or Z97 chipset. I will be testing each of these 4 BGA-to-LGA CPUs as well as a regular 4th gen i5, all with the same hardware using this Gigabyte Z97 motherboard. I'll also be using the 4GB variant of AMD RX 480 and 16GB of dual channel RAM. As thermal paste I'll be using GD900. This is very similar to MX4. I'll not be using a fancy one since this is the only I can afford to waste for this right now, but I will be using a fair amount for every CPU. I'll be benchmarking 4 different Sketchy CPUs, 2 from one Taobao seller and 2 from another Taobao seller. From the first seller I've bought 2 CPUs that I already showed in a previous video briefly. These I'll be calling Xeon and i7. They have a custom made IHS which is thicker than a regular one and it requires a small socket modification. From seller 2 I also bought 2 CPUs. I meant to buy 2 quad-core ones, but I ended up getting one quad-core i5 and one dual-core i5. Yes, a dual-core i5, since these are converted from laptop CPUs and there are dual-core laptop i5s. I think they just sent me a wrong CPU, but since it's bought from Taobao there's really nothing that can be done. Well, I'll just review this dual-core thing. These CPUs also have a custom IHS added onto them, but this time they've managed to get it to be regular thickness, so socket modifications are not needed. However, this IHS on the CPUs from seller 2 is quite rough and it looks unfinished and well sketchy. More about this later in the video. Here I am taking the socket of the board and installing the washers under it so that the socket will be on the same height with the CPU. Here you can see the difference in thickness between CPUs from seller 1 and seller 2. CPU Z actually does a surprisingly good job at recognizing these CPUs and seems to get their specs right as well. You can pause if you're interested in the specs. In Cinebench R20, the Sketchy Xeon and Sketchy i7 place above the 4th gen i5. It looks like Geekbench doesn't accept results from unidentified CPUs. In Geekbench as well as PCMark 10, the 4th Gen i5 performs noticeably better than any of these Sketchy Broadwell CPUs. Moving to game benchmarks, first tested game is Beamng Drive with high settings 1080p. The physics benchmarks give very expected kind of results. The 4th Gen i5 gets around 55 to 60 FPS in this scenario. The Sketchy Xeon CPU seems to get around 3 or 4 FPS less on the average. The dual-core i5 gets around 30 FPS. In the terms of FPS, the quad-core i5 seems to perform better than the comparison 4th Gen i5, but notice the temperatures, it's hovering around 100 degrees. Also, I noticed inconsistent frame times, sometimes with this CPU, so this runs actually worse than the 4th Gen i5 and Xeon were able to run this game. The Sketchy i7 seems to be around on the same level as the Sketchy Xeon, being a few frames behind the 4th Gen i5. In shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p high settings, the 4th Gen i5 seems to get around 45 to 60 FPS depending on the situation. In this game, the Sketchy Xeon gets noticeably better FPS compared to the 4th Gen i5, beating it with maybe 3 to 5 FPS. The dual-core i5 gets around 30 FPS, being barely playable. With the Sketchy quad-core i5, I'm getting around the same FPS as with the 4th Gen i5, except the temps are through the roof again and inconsistent frame times are still a problem. The Sketchy i7's performance seems to be around on the same level to the Sketchy Xeon. So this beats the 4th Gen i5 too. So as a conclusion, these CPUs are interesting and they perform around the same level as 4th Gen ones. You're probably better off buying used 4th Gen CPUs than these things off Taobao. Maybe the Xeon and i7 seem most reasonable deals since the price gap between i5s and i7s is usually big. The Sketchy i7 has quite poor performance on some other games I've tested it with, but the Xeon seems to be quite solid. Also, one really weird thing that happened while I was testing these CPUs was that I was pretty sure I had broken one of these GPUs. I replaced it with an identical RX 480 and it worked. I tested it many times and it looks like the CPUs from Seller 2 only work with one of these graphics cards, which is really weird because they should be identical. The CPUs from Seller 1 work with both of these graphics cards. If you have any suggestions what might be happening here, I'd be very much interested to know. Here's a few close-up shots of a CPU from Seller 2. I think the bad IHS might be part of the reason why it runs so hot, but then again, some laptop CPUs really run at 100 degrees, I think. Anyways, thanks for watching. I'm out of here.